Hi everyone, I'm Caroline from Coraline Street, and I was invited by fabricstore.com to make a step-by-step video tutorial for one of their premium sewing patterns, the Nico. This video is a complement to the instruction booklet that comes with the pattern so you can follow along while sewing. All of fabricstore.com's premium patterns are printed on high-quality plotting paper with 4 sizes printed on the roll, and each size is printed in a different color, making it very easy to differentiate between them. The patterns arrive rolled in a tube with a hook included in case you like to hang them, and also comes with a fully illustrated instruction booklet with all the information you need, including a cutting guide for all sizes and a pattern card for easy reference. Nico has 4 different views: a maxi dress, a mini dress, a tunic, and a camisole. Since the pattern is cut on the bias, it creates a lovely drape to the fabric. And because of the built-in ease, you can put it on or take it off without any fastenings like buttons or zippers. The pattern features a French dart, which creates shape in the front from the waist to the bust, differently from a traditional dart that only helps shape the bust. Today I'll be making the maxi dress with you, but if you choose to make any of the other views, you can follow along the same steps. The skill level for this pattern is intermediate, but I'll explain every step very carefully so I believe everyone can follow along. For sizing and yardage, you can pause the video to read, or you can also find this information in the description of the video. The recommended fabric for this project is woven linen that's at least 55 inches or 140 centimeters wide. To make mine, I'll be using fabricstore.com's medium weight linen in their signature finish, but you can also make it with heavyweight or lightweight linen, it just depends on your preference. You don't need any special needles. I'll be using a universal needle, which is appropriate for the weight of my linen, and you'll also need all-purpose thread. For some steps, I might use a contrasting color to help with visibility, but make sure yours matches the color of your fabric. When cutting, make sure to transfer all the notches to the fabric. They will serve as a really important guide later when we're sewing the pieces together. You can follow the cutting layouts found on the instruction booklet, but make sure to place the grain line arrows parallel to the selvage of the fabric. You need to cut 1 front and 1 back, 1 neck binding strip and 2 armhole binding strips. And if you're making the maxi version like I am, you also need to cut 1 front extension and 1 back extension. If you get confused, you can always refer back to the pattern card, and make sure to handle your pattern pieces very carefully once they're cut to avoid any unwanted stretch, especially along the bias cut edges because they can stretch out of place very easily. If you're not sure if it has stretch or not, you can compare it to the paper pattern to check. Just make sure to consider the seam allowance as well. So the first step is to stay stitch the neckline and the armholes. This will keep the edges stable and prevent them from stretching and deforming while we're handling the garment later on. Take the front and back pieces and sew a row of stitches a 1/4 inch or 0.6 centimeters away from the edge. Don't pull or push the fabric while feeding it through the machine, just naturally sew on top of it. Then secure the raw edges of the shoulder straps to prevent the fabric from fraying. I'll be using my overlocker, but you can use a zigzag stitch if you don't have one. Now we need to sew the darts. We'll be using French seams to do that. So take the front piece and with the wrong sides together, align the dart edges and stitch here using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then open the garment flat and press the seam to one of the sides. Next, fold the dart over to encase the raw edges of the previous seam. Stitch a second seam with 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then press the seam allowance going downwards. And then repeat the same step for the other dart. Now place the front and back pieces with the right sides facing each other. And stitch a seam across each shoulder with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then we need to press the seam open to reduce the bulk. You only need to follow the next step if you chose to make the maxi version of the dress. If not, you can just skip it. Take the front and the front extension pieces. So with the wrong sides facing each other, you need to align the extension to the edge of the front. Make sure to match the notches that we made and pin it in place. And now we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam. Press the seam open Then fold the extension back like this and press along the stitch line. Next, we need to stitch a 3/8 of an inch seam from the edge of the seam. And then we're going to press the front seam down towards the hem of the dress. Then we're going to turn the dress with the right sides facing up to do a row of top stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the previous stitch line that we made. And with that, we'll catch all of the layers of the front seam underneath. Now place the back with the right sides facing up and the front with the right sides facing down. They must have the right sides facing each other. Make sure to match all the notches at the sides and pin it in place. I recommend sewing only one of the sides first because it's going to make it easier to complete the next steps. And now from the underarm seam, you need to stitch a 5/8 of an inch seam until you reach the last notch. This one, that's a straight line on the pattern that indicates the beginning of the slit opening at the sides. But only the maxi version will have the slit. For all the other views, you can sew the entire side seam. Make sure to backstitch a lot of times at the opening of the slit just to make sure that it's not going to unravel later. And now to finish the side seam, we need to press all the seam allowance open, including the slit area too. Now we need to fold the seam allowance a 1/4 inch down and press. You can use as many pins as you need to keep it in place. And now we need to top stitch the folded edge through all the layers of the fabric. To make it easier to sew the bias strip to the neckline, I made a notch exactly at the center of the back neckline. And now we need to place the bias strip right sides together, and we'll start placing it around 1/2 inch beyond the mark that we made. And use as many pins as we need to secure it in place. And these curves that are tighter might need to be slightly eased to keep the bias strip flat. I'll transfer the center back notch to the bias binding as well. And now, starting around 1 inch away from the center back notch, we're going to start sewing a 1/4 inch seam to join the bias strip to the neckline. And we also need to leave around 2 inches without sewing at the end. Now we'll fold back the beginning of the bias strip to take it out of the way. And we'll continue to align the ending until we reach the center notch. And we'll clip another reference notch here. And now we fold the center back in the middle. And we'll place the remaining edges together, pin it in place. And stitch a seam right at the notch to join them together. Now we'll trim it and leave around 1/2 inch seam allowance. We'll open the seam and press it with an iron. And we'll finish the seam stitching the bias strip to the neckline. I also made small cuts all around the seam allowance to release the tension on top of the curves. And now we're going to press the bias towards the inside of the neckline. Now after pressing, we're going to understitch the bias strip. We run a seam 1/16 of an inch away from the previous seam, catching the seam allowance underneath and sewing it to the bias strip. Now we need to turn it wrong sides out, and we'll wrap the bias over the raw edge of the neckline and press it. After ironing, you can trim the width of the bias down to a 1/4 inch from the folded edge. And then you can fold the bias strip and the seam allowance all together in another 1/4 inch turn and press again. And now we're going to sew row stitches on the outer edge of the bias strip, making sure to go through all the layers, keeping the row edges inside. And you need to repeat the same steps for the armholes, but this time with your starting location around 1/2 inch from the underarm seam in the back. And now it's time to sew the hem. For the maxi version, we'll stop and start at each side slit, but all the other versions will have a continuous hem all around the bottom. With the wrong side of the garment facing out, turn the hem up 3/8 of an inch and press all across, both the front and the back. Then fold the hem up a second 3/8 of an inch turn, press all the way around again, and stitch the hem 3/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge. Now give your dress a good press and your Nico is complete. For more patterns, you can check fabricstore.com's website, and if you need additional assistance, you can contact them via email. I really hope you guys liked this tutorial. See you next time. Bye!